The blood on the marble floor of Le Petit Oiseau didn't match the cheap bleach in Thomas's bucket. They called him a parasite, laughing as they kicked his mop aside. But when the city's most feared underboss dropped to his knees, trembling, the room went dead silent. They didn't know who Thomas really was. The scent of stale pine cleaner and cheap ammonia always clung to the fabric of his oversized blue jumpsuit. Thomas didn't mind the smell. It was a camouflage, a chemical shroud that erased the scent of gunpowder, expensive Cuban tobacco, and old money. To the arrogant young men and women who frequented the Gilded Anchor on 4th Street, he was simply the ghost with the mop, a blank space in a faded uniform. They walked right past him, sometimes over his wet floors, leaving muddy tracks without a glance or an apology. It was October 14th. A biting wind screamed off the Hudson River, rattling the thick glass panes of the restaurant. Thomas squeezed the handle of his industrial wringer, watching the gray water cascade back into the yellow bucket. His hands were thick, calloused, and bore a faint, jagged scar across the left knuckle, a relic from a lifetime they couldn't possibly comprehend. At table 7 sat Derek Albright, a mid-level enforcer for the syndicate that claimed ownership of the Lower East Side. Derek was 24, dripping in gold chains that clinked against his collarbone, and possessed the kind of loud, unearned confidence that usually preceded a closed casket. Beside him sat 2 other soldiers, tearing into prime rib and washing it down with $100 bottles of Cabernet. "Hey, swamp water," Derek barked, not even looking up as he flicked a greasy linen napkin onto the floor. It landed exactly 2 inches from Thomas's worn work boots. "You missed a spot. And while you're down there, fetch another basket of sourdough. Make it quick, old man." Thomas didn't stiffen. He didn't let the fire in his chest reach his eyes. He merely bent his knees, his 60-year-old joints popping softly in the ambient noise of the dining room, and picked up the soiled cloth. "Right away, sir," Thomas murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded intentionally broken. Behind the kitchen doors, the air was hot and thick with grease. Clara, a 22-year-old waitress with dark circles under her hazel eyes, was leaning against the stainless steel prep table. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely balance a tray of crystal flutes. Clara was a single mother. Her 3-year-old son, Leo, was currently sleeping in a makeshift crib of coats in the manager's back office, because she couldn't afford a sitter for the night shift. "Don't let him get to you, Thomas," Clara whispered, her voice cracking as she handed him the fresh bread. He's dangerous. I heard him talking about the docks. He said someone is getting buried tonight under Pier 42. "I am used to it, Clara," Thomas replied gently, his eyes softening as he looked at her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded $100 bill, part of the meager cash tips he occasionally scrounged. He pressed it into her palm. "For the boy's medicine. I heard him coughing when you brought him in." Clara gasped, trying to push his hand away. "No, Thomas, you need this. Your rent at the tenement on Broome Street is already late. I know it is. I can't take your money." "Take it," Thomas commanded. It wasn't a plea. It was a quiet, absolute directive that carried a strange, heavy weight. Clara blinked, startled by the brief flash of iron in his demeanor, before she nodded, tears welling in her eyes, and tucked the bill into her apron. When Thomas returned to the dining room, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter at table 7 had died down, replaced by a tense, hushed urgency. A new figure had arrived. It was Arthur Pendleton, the regional captain who managed the syndicate's extortion rackets. Arthur was an older man, practical, ruthless, and usually entirely unflappable. Tonight, however, his face was the color of curdled milk. "He's coming," Arthur said, leaning over the table, his palms flat on the white tablecloth. The old man. He found out about the skimming at the shipping terminal. "He's personally coming down to clean house," Derek scoffed, though he swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "The boss? Nobody's seen him in 3 years. Half the families think he's dead, living in Italy or rotting in a federal prison under an alias." Why would he care about a measly 50 grand from the docks? Because it's not about the 50 grand, you idiot, Arthur hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that Thomas caught perfectly as he systematically wiped down the adjacent empty booth. It's about the principle. The old man rules this entire city from the shadows. Every precinct captain, every judge, every port authority director answers to him. If he thinks we are growing soft or disloyal, we don't just lose our jobs, we lose our skin. Thomas continued his slow, methodical circles with the rag. $52,410 to be exact, Thomas thought to himself. He knew the exact number because the ledger sat in a reinforced wall safe inside a brownstone on 12th Street, a property registered to a shell corporation he owned. Suddenly, Derek slammed his hand on the table, frustrated by his own mounting fear. He looked over and saw Thomas standing a few feet away, seemingly staring at them. In reality, Thomas was looking past them, watching the headlights of a black sedan pull up outside the restaurant's fogged windows. "What the hell are you looking at, Janitor?" Derek roared, standing up so fast his chair screeched against the floorboards. He stepped toward Thomas, grabbed the front of the faded blue jumpsuit, and shoved him backward. Thomas let himself fall. He collided with the corner of a heavy oak pillar, dropping his rag. The impact bruised his ribs, but he didn't make a sound. He lay there on the floor, looking up with a perfectly crafted expression of terror. "Derek, stop it! Leave him alone!" Clara screamed, rushing out from the kitchen, her maternal instincts overriding her survival mechanism. She threw herself between the armed mobster and the old janitor, her small frame trembling as she glared at Derek. "He's just an old man. He doesn't know anything." Derek laughed, a ugly, cruel sound, and drew a nickel-plated .45 pistol from his waistband. He pressed the cold barrel directly against Clara's forehead. "You want to join him, bitch? You think your life matters? Both of you are trash. I could paint this wall with your brains and the police wouldn't even open a folder." Arthur didn't stop him. The soldiers watched with cold indifference. Clara closed her eyes, a single tear escaping, whispering a silent prayer for her son sleeping in the back room. From his position on the floor, Thomas's eyes changed. The submissive, weary glaze vanished, replaced by an ancient, terrifying void. The silence in the restaurant was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the low hum of the commercial refrigerator in the back. Derek Albright's gun hand froze, the nickel-plated barrel still hovering inches from Clara's face. But his fingers had gone completely numb. He looked from Dominic, a man known in the underworld as the personal executioner for the commission, to the old man sitting on the floor in a stained jumpsuit. Thomas sighed. It was a long, weary sound of a man whose peaceful retirement had been rudely interrupted. He braced his hands on the floor and stood up. The simulated frailty in his spine was gone. He stood perfectly straight, his shoulders broad, his posture commanding an invisible perimeter that no one dared cross. Clara collapsed backward into a chair, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She looked at Thomas as if he were a ghost, her mind refusing to connect the kind old man who gave her money for medicine with the terrifying aura currently radiating from him. "Dominic!" Thomas said, his natural voice finally emerging. It wasn't a rasp. It was a deep, resonant baritone that carried the absolute weight of a king. "You're late. I told you 8:15. It is currently 8:18. "My apologies, mister." "Rossi," Dominic whispered, his head remaining bowed. The traffic on the Williamsburg Bridge was congested. Rossi, the name struck the room like a lightning bolt. Thomas Rossi, the Leviathan of the Eastern Seaboard. The man who had spent 40 years building an empire out of concrete, blood, and political leverage, only to vanish into folklore. Arthur Pendleton's knees gave out. He literally sank into his chair, his chest heaving as a cold sweat soaked through his silk shirt. "Mr. Rossi, we didn't know. Dear God, we didn't know. If we had any idea you were overseeing this location." Thomas ignored Arthur entirely. He walked over to the table, grabbed a clean linen napkin, and began wiping his hands, removing the residue of the floor he had just been forced to clean. His eyes were locked entirely on Derek. Derek was trembling so violently the gold chains around his neck were jingling like cheap wind chimes. He lowered his gun, his eyes wide with a primal, animalistic terror. I was just. He didn't. She didn't show respect, mister. Rossi, I was just maintaining order. You put a piece of iron against the head of a woman who works for me, Thomas said softly, his tone conversational, almost pleasant. He stepped closer to Derek, the distance shrinking until he was standing a mere 6 inches away. Thomas was shorter than the young enforcer, but in that moment he cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire room. You spilled grease on my floor. You insulted my bread. And you scammed $52,000 from the container ships at Pier 42. I can explain that, sir. Arthur chimed in, his voice cracking with desperation. The dock workers, they demanded a higher cut. We had to adjust the books. Silence, Thomas said. He didn't raise his voice, but Arthur instantly choked on his own words, snapping his mouth shut. Thomas turned his attention back to Derek. He reached out and gently, almost tenderly, took the .45 pistol from Derek's limp hand. Derek didn't resist. He couldn't. His nervous system had completely surrendered to fear. You like this weapon, Derek? Thomas asked, turning the heavy gun over in his calloused hands. It's flashy, chrome, loud. It tells everyone in the room that you have power because you carry a piece of death in your pocket. Thomas suddenly gripped the barrel and slammed the heavy butt of the gun directly into Derek's mouth. The sound of shattering teeth and breaking bone cracked through the restaurant. Derek screamed, a muffled, bloody gurgle as he stumbled backward, clutching his broken jaw. Blood sprayed across the white tablecloth, ruining the remains of the prime rib. But real power, Thomas whispered, tossing the gun carelessly into his yellow mop bucket, where it splashed into the dirty gray water, is when you don't need a gun to make a man tear his own life apart. Thomas turned to Dominic. Take Arthur and the other two out to the warehouse on Cherry Street. Audit their books. Every dime. If a single penny is missing from the last 3 years, put them in the foundation of the new stadium project in Queens. No, please, mister. Rossi, 40 years I've served this family. Arthur wept, dragged out of his chair by 2 of the charcoal-suited men. They didn't struggle. They were limp sacks of meat being hauled toward the rear exit. Their boots dragged across the floor, leaving long, dark smudges. And leave Derek here, Thomas added coldly. He has an outstanding debt to pay to the establishment. Within 2 minutes, the restaurant was empty of the syndicate members. Only Thomas, Dominic, Clara, and the bleeding, whimpering Derek remained. The wind outside continued to howl, a stark contrast to the deathly stillness inside. Thomas walked over to Clara. She flinched as he approached, pulling her knees up toward her chest. The warmth she had felt from him over the past 6 months had been replaced by a suffocating dread. She was looking at a monster. Thomas saw the fear in her eyes, and for a fraction of a second, a profound, agonizing loneliness flickered across his face. The mask of the untouchable boss cracked, just enough for a glimpse of the hollowed-out soul underneath. He had all the power in the world, yet he was completely, utterly isolated. "Clara," he said gently, reaching out a hand, but stopping himself before he touched her shoulder. "You have nothing to fear from me. You showed courage tonight. You defended an old man who you thought had no one in the world to protect him. Who? What are you?" She whispered, her voice trembling. "I am the man who keeps the wolves from your door," Thomas replied. He looked over at Derek, who was rocking back and forth on the floor, spitting blood and teeth. "Derek, pick up that mop." Derek looked up, his eyes bloodshot and swimming with tears. "What?" he mumbled through his broken jaw. "You heard me," Thomas said, his voice dropping to that icy, absolute register. "You are going to numb every drop of blood you just spilled on my floor. And tomorrow you will report to work here at 6 a.m. You are the new night shift janitor of the Gilded Anchor. You will work for minimum wage. You will give 80% of your paycheck directly to Clara for her son's medical bills. If you are 1 minute late, or if Clara sheds a single tear because of you, Dominic will visit your mother's house in Staten Island." The room grew impossibly cold. The name hung in the air like a phantom, choking the breath from Thomas's lungs. His daughter, Sarah. She had been dead for 6 years, buried in a private plot in upstate New York, under a name no one in the syndicate was supposed to know. The official report said it was a tragic car accident on a rain-slicked highway in Vermont. Thomas had wept over her closed casket, broken, believing that his sins had finally claimed his only child through the cruel random roll of cosmic dice. The man in the white linen suit was Julian Vance. No, Thomas reminded himself, forcing his mind to reject the band names of his past, forcing his focus onto the man's true identity. It was Victor Bianchi, the exiled underboss of the rival Moretti family, a man Thomas thought he had driven out of the tri-state area a decade ago. "You're dead, Victor," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards of the brownstone. He didn't move an inch. His hands hung loosely at his sides, but every muscle was coiled, ready to spring. "We both are, Thomas. We just haven't stopped breathing yet," Victor replied, his fingers lazily tracing the edge of the stolen ledger. He looked up, his eyes hollow and devoid of light. "You thought you were so clever." The great Thomas Rossi, disappearing into the slums, pretending to wash floors and scrub toilets like a broken old dog. You thought if you built a big enough myth around your absence, nobody would look for the truth. But Sarah, she was soft. She had your eyes, but none of your iron. Dominic shifted his weight, his silenced weapon leveled directly at Victor's forehead. "Give the word, boss. I'll paint this wall with him." "No," Thomas commanded, raising a single finger. His eyes never left Victor's face. "Dominic, check the perimeter. He didn't walk in here alone." "Smart old man," Victor chuckled, not looking at Dominic as the large man cautiously backed out of the room, his weapon still raised until he cleared the doorway. "But you're looking for the wrong threat, Thomas. The call isn't coming from outside the house. It's already inside your empire." Victor stood up, letting the heavy steel ledger slide off his lap. It hit the hardwood floor with a dull, echoing thud. He smoothed the front of his pristine white jacket, entirely unbothered by the fact that he was trapped in the safe house of the most dangerous man in the city. "What did you do to her?" Thomas whispered. The trembling was back, but it wasn't the fake frailty of the janitor. It was the volatile vibration of a volcano seconds before an eruption. The skin around his knuckles turned stark white. "I didn't have to do much," Victor said, taking a slow step forward. She thought she was marrying a handsome young real estate developer named Robert. She didn't know Robert was my nephew. She didn't know that the brake lines on her pretty little Volvo were cut by someone she invited into her own home. But before she went over that guardrail on Route 7, she gave up everything. She wanted to live so badly, Thomas. She told us about the ledger. She told us about the safe house on 12th Street. And she told us about your little retirement plan. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. The car accident wasn't an accident. For 6 years, he had carried the crushing guilt of her death, believing it was God punishing him for his violent life. But it wasn't God. It was a calculated, cold-blooded execution. The grief that had kept him hidden in a blue janitor's jumpsuit for years suddenly mutated, transforming into a pure, blinding rage that burned away every ounce of his humanity. "Where is Robert?" Thomas asked, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Oh, he's around," Victor smiled, a cruel, sharp expression. "In fact, he's currently looking after some old friends of yours. You see, Thomas, you made a mistake tonight. You showed a weakness. The great Leviathan of the city actually cares about a little waitress and her coughing brat." Thomas's heart stopped. "Clara, Leo, you think you're the only one who watches from the shadows?" Victor mocked, stepping closer until he was just outside arm's reach. "We've been tracking you for months. We watched you give her money. We watched you look at that boy, like he was the grandson you never got to hold. Arthur Pendleton wasn't just skimming for himself, Thomas. He was working for me. He was the bait to draw you out of the shadows, to make you reveal yourself in front of witnesses. And it worked beautifully. Before Victor could finish his sentence, the heavy silence of the night was shattered by the sound of gunfire from the street outside. A short, suppressed burst. Then a heavy thud. "Dominic!" Thomas shouted, breaking his stance. The front door burst open, but it wasn't Dominic who walked through. It was a young man, barely 30, wearing a dark leather jacket stained with fresh blood. He was dragging Dominic's massive body by the collar of his tailored suit. Dominic was alive, but barely. A deep gash across his temple was pouring blood into his eyes, and his right arm hung uselessly at a broken angle. The young man tossed Dominic onto the floor next to the ledger. He looked up, his face an exact replica of Victor's cruel features. "Robert, the big guy fights hard," Robert said, wiping his bloody hands on a silk handkerchief. "But he's slow, just like your whole operation, Rossi. You're old. The city belongs to a new generation now." Thomas looked down at Dominic, his most loyal soldier, broken on the floor. He looked at Victor, the man who had murdered his daughter. He looked at Robert, the man who was currently targeting an innocent mother and child, just to break his spirit. He was surrounded. His safe house was compromised. His empire was fractured from the inside. For the first time in 40 years, Thomas Rossi was entirely cornered. "You want the city, Victor?" Thomas asked, his voice steady, though his chest heaved. "Take it. Take the ledger. Take the docks. Take every dollar in the Chase bank accounts. Leave the girl and the boy out of this. They are nothing to the syndicate." Victor laughed, a harsh grating sound that filled the small room. "Oh, Thomas, you still don't get it. We don't just want your crown. We want to see you watch it burn." Robert called the boys at the Gilded Anchor. "Tell them to clean up the loose ends. Start with the kid." Robert pulled a silver phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen. Thomas didn't hesitate. The world shrank to the smell of gunpowder and the wet, heavy thud of blood, dripping onto parquet wood. Thomas slumped against the baseboard, teeth bared, holding his shredded shoulder. The fire in his collarbone was nothing compared to the ice in his belly. Robert's hand was still pressed to his ear, waiting for the confirmation click from the line at the Gilded Anchor. "She cried, you know," Robert murmured, smiling as he lowered the device. "Your Sarah," right before the Volvo hit the guardrail. She kept saying, "My dad will kill you. I told her you were just an old man who washed floors." Victor raised the revolver higher, aligning the front sight with the bridge of Thomas's nose. "Any last words for the city you built, Thomas?" Thomas didn't look at the barrel. He looked past it, straight into Victor's hollow, greedy eyes. "Just one," Thomas rasped. From the floor beside the leather chair, a blood-soaked arm shot out like a steel trap. Dominic wasn't unconscious. He had been waiting, pooling his remaining strength, holding his breath while blood filled his socket. His left hand clamped around Victor's ankle with bone-crushing force, yanking the older man off balance. Victor gasped, his shot going wild. The bullet shattered the glass lampshade behind Thomas, showering the room in sharp, golden sparks. In that single second of chaos, Thomas moved. He didn't rise like a 60-year-old wounded mobster. He exploded forward like a phantom unleashed. He ignored the blinding agony in his left shoulder, driving his right palm directly upward into Robert's chin. The young man's head snapped back, his teeth clattering like dice. The silver phone slipped from his fingers, falling toward the floor. Thomas caught the device mid-air, hit the speaker button, and thrust his face towards the microphone before the call could disconnect. "Abort!" Thomas roared into the speaker, his voice a thunderclap that shook the room. "Code 0, stand down." A confused voice crackled back through the phone from the restaurant kitchen. "Mr. Bianchi? Is that? It's Rossi." Thomas Tasser growled into the receiver, stepping on Robert's neck as the young man writhed on the floor. "And if either of you touches that girl or her child, I will skin every man on your payroll alive while they watch." Throw down your weapons and run." Silence hit the line, followed by the clatter of handguns hitting the restaurant tile and the frantic sound of boots sprinting toward 4th Street. Victor scrambled backward on his hands and knees, reaching for his fallen revolver. But Thomas was already there. His heavy boot came down squarely on Victor's wrist, the crunch of small bones echoing through the safe house. Victor screamed, a high, pathetic sound that shattered his sophisticated facade. Thomas leaned down, kicking the gun away, and dragged Victor up by the lapels of his ruined white suit. He slammed the rival boss against the wall, pinning him with a strength born of 30 years of blood, sweat, and absolute rain. "You lied to me about my daughter," Thomas whispered, his face inches from Victor's. "You made me think I killed her with my life. You made me sit in the dark for 6 years. "Thomas, please," Victor wheezed, his eyes bulging as the breath was squeezed out of him. It was business. Just business. "No," Thomas said softly, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet clarity. "Sweeping your mess off my floor. That is business." He didn't pull a trigger. He didn't use a knife. Thomas simply shifted his weight and drove a low, brutal blow into Victor's solar plexus, knocking the man senseless, before tossing him like a sack of wet rags onto the floor next to his bleeding nephew. Dominic pushed himself up against the armchair, coughing up dark blood, a ragged grin stretching across his battered face. "Code 0, boss. You haven't used that since '98. "Get up, Dominic," Thomas said, tearing a strip of linen from Victor's jacket and wrapping it tight around his own bleeding shoulder. "We have a city to clean." An hour later, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the rain clouds over the Manhattan skyline, 3 heavy black SUVs pulled up to the curb outside the Gilded Anchor. The street was silent. The front glass was dark. Thomas stepped out of the lead vehicle, no longer wearing the faded blue jumpsuit. He wore a bespoke charcoal gray wool coat over a dark suit, his silver hair brushed back, his posture straight as iron. His arm was bound beneath his shirt, but his stride was effortless, absolute, and terrifying. He pushed open the heavy front doors. The dining room was pristine. The blood on the white tablecloths had been stripped. The broken glass had been swept away. At table 7, Derek was still on his knees, his hands raw, his gold chains gone, methodically wringing out a wet rag into a yellow bucket. He froze as the shadow of the charcoal coat fell over him. Derek looked up, trembling, his jaw wired shut, his eyes filled with total submission. He didn't speak. He just kept scrubbing. Thomas walked past him without a word, pushing open the heavy kitchen doors. Clara was standing near the prep table, holding a mug of warm tea, her coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. Beside her, little Leo was sitting on a plastic crate, happily rolling his small toy car back and forth across the stainless steel. When Clara heard the door, she flinched, stepping in front of her son. But when she saw Thomas standing there, dressed not as a janitor, but as the king of the city, she stopped. She looked at his face. The cold, lethal mask he carried into the streets was gone. In its place was the same quiet, sad eyes of the man who had given her a folded $100 bill for medicine. "Thomas?" she whispered. "The restaurant belongs to you now, Clara," Thomas said softly, taking a thick, leather-bound deed from his inner coat pocket and placing it on the stainless steel counter beside her tea. "The building, the land, and the business. Fully paid, no debt. No syndicate will ever walk through those doors again." Clara stared at the document, then looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't take this. I don't know how to run a place like this." "You already do," Thomas replied, the ghost of a warm smile touching his lips. "You protected your family. You stood your ground when armed men pointed iron at your head. That is all it takes." He turned toward the exit, but little Leo scrambled off his crate, running forward and wrapping his arms around Thomas's leg once more, his tiny hands clutching the fine wool of the expensive coat. Thomas paused. In a world built on power and cruelty, true strength is found in the willingness to protect the innocent. Thomas Rossi chose to live in the shadows to guard what mattered most, proving that no crown is heavier than a father's heart. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss another gripping story.